Hello and welcome to another edition of the Folklore Podcast Book Club. I'm Mark Norman, folklore researcher and author. On today's episode of the book club, we're going to be discussing the title Introducing the Medieval Dragon, published by University of Wales Press and written by Thomas Honegger. The book explores the characteristics of the medieval dragon and discusses the sometimes differing views found in the relevant medieval text types. It's based on an intimate knowledge of the primary texts by the author, and it presents new interpretations of well-known literary works and also takes into consideration paintings and other depictions of dragons. Thomas Honegger is Professor for English Medieval Studies at the Friedrich Schiller University in Germany, and has published on animals, medieval romance, and the work of J.R.R. Tolkien. Guest reviewer Hilary Wilson spoke to Professor Honegger about this book.
So thank you very much for coming onto this podcast today, Dr. Honegger. Today we'll be talking about your new book, Introducing the Medieval Dragon, published by the University of Wales Press. This is a very exciting book, the flagship title, in fact, for the new series on medieval animals. Before we begin, however, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what first got you interested in the subject of dragons?
Well, I'm Swiss, as they always tell me out here. I ended up in Germany, and so, you can't get really rid of your Swiss accent, which, yeah, that's the way it is. But I've become a naturalized German because I've been at the University of Vienna for the last 21 years. And I got interested in dragons because they were always present in the stories and legends I read. When I was a little toddler, well, not toddler, but when I was kind of something like 7 or 8 years old, I think I started on some kind of simplified retellings of the classical legends, but also of the old knightly tales, and of course you have your dragon here and there. And so I kind of had an interest in dragons right from the start. I mean, they were part of my, you could say, imaginary setup. I was a bit disappointed to find out they don't really exist, but yeah, there you go. Part of your disenchantment with the reality.
Well, according to some of the stories of origins, they might actually have existed.
True, there's still hope, yeah.
And whether or not they existed, it seems like they do have a certain legend associated with places, so that they do become part of the cultural landscape, whether you'd like them to or not.
Indeed, and the interesting thing is that some of those motifs, they seem to travel across cultures and they become adapted. I mean, there's one story about someone called Winkelried, not the famous Winkelried that everybody knows about, but another Winkelried who kills a dragon, but is poisoned by the blood that kind of gets in touch with him. So obviously, dragon blood is very, very poisonous. And similar stories about the hero who kills a dragon being poisoned. I mean, you can look at Beowulf. How does he die? Poisoned by the dragon. How do other kind of also more kind of legendary heroes die? Mostly kind of poisoned by the dragon blood. Not so much eaten up by the dragon, but poisoned. So you have these motifs that are taken up and that are transported over thousands of miles and adapted and retold. And I found this fascinating.
One of the things that I was thinking about when reading your book has to do with that sort of transportation of myth. It wasn't something that you delved into too deeply, but you were talking about the Chinese dragon, getting transported, to other countries, particularly through the vestments that were being worn with the Chinese dragon on them in the Alps.
True.
And I was thinking about how in a lot of modern dragon stories, that idea of the wisdom of the dragon has kind of transported a little bit of mixing with the Eastern mythology with the Western. Yeah. Do you think that that's more of a product of globalization, or do you think that that's something that we do start to see earlier on, with Smaug and, that becoming more of the Western motif?
The problem is, of course, as long as you have the dominance of Christianity and its symbolism, it's very, very hard to kind of recoin the symbolism of the dragon. The dragon is closely associated with the devil. And so to have something like a positive image to the dragon, I mean, you do get it sometimes in Christianity. The lion, for example, is ambiguous because in the Bible, you have Christ, the Lion of Judah. So it's very positively connotated. But also in one of his letters, I think St. Peter says, the devil is like a roaring lion prowling at night, devouring your soul. And so you have this ambiguity in there. But with the dragon, you don't have an ambiguity in the Christian context. It's definitely the bad guy, the big bad beast. And so I think it takes two components, a kind of a secularization, a moving away from Christianity and the globalization. You come into contact with other traditions like the Asian tradition where the dragon is mostly positive.
Yeah, right. The wise dragon.
Indeed.
But the wise dragon could also just be, lucky having the tongue located near the liver so that it can trick you.
Indeed. I mean, there are some dragons, kind of, I would say, on the interface between East and West. That really, I still hope one day to really kind of research that. There is a story about Hardrada, a historical person, and he was a king of Norway, and he at one time was serving with the Varangian guards, the Viking guards in Byzantium. And the story goes about that there he kind of uncovered a were-dragon, a dragon who transforms into a man. And that goes to visit the wife of one of the guards, and this guard complains, and Harald is able to trick him so that he reveals his true identity and then finds the dragon lair and they smoke the dragon out. So it's, the idea that you have a dragon turning into a man, this is really Asian. This is really not, you have the other way around. You have man turning into something else. That's a Western, with werewolves, werebears, were-dragons, we know that. But the other way around, that's really weird. And so I was wondering, is this kind of an Eastern influence? Because Byzantium, of course, would be a melting pot, so to speak, where you have Western and Eastern influences coming together.
Yeah, that's incredibly interesting. I was thinking of that as well with what you mentioned in the book before, the idea of femininity being represented, the two various sides of it with the bestial primal dragon and the virginal woman, and how later that idea was played upon by Ursula K. Le Guin in Earthsea, with the idea of women being the origin of dragons. But the idea of the dragon actually being able to turn into the person is, quite the inversion of that.
It is. I mean, it's really kind of, I mean, Ursula K. Le Guin would be a very good example of someone who makes a dragon a positive figure, being a wife and all that. So she is someone who takes the Eastern tradition and reshapes it and gives us a kind of a new interpretation of it. I mean, I appreciate her books very much also for that, apart from being great literature.
Yes, especially the later books in the series that came out more in the 2000s, because originally the dragons were more of a questionable figure.
Yeah.
But the inversion of that would be what G.R.R. Martin did.
Yes.
That turned into much more of a typical dragon story.
They are, yes, indeed. And he also, as usual, he kind of subverts things. They don't eat their princess. Suddenly the dragon, the princess is the mother of the dragons and stuff like that.
And she very much becomes the dragon, at least in the television show.
Indeed, very much so. That's her dragon nature, so to speak, takes over.
Yeah, I have to say, as much as I was torn by the ending of it, I appreciated a lot more after reading your book and realizing more of the tropes that were being played with.
Yeah.
It reframed things quite nicely.
Well, one of these days, I hope to write a book about George Martin's work. I've made a start in 2017, but
Oh, that's fantastic.
if you're head of department and and everything else, you're kept busy with a lot of other stuff. Yeah.
I would definitely be interested in hearing your take on some of his, other dragon stories apart from just the, main A Song of Ice and Fire books, like The Myth of the Ice Dragon.
Yeah, indeed, he did that.
I thought that was a very interesting, again, bit of a subversion of it.
Yeah.
And, the whole question again of people turning into dragons in his books and whether or not that is something that could happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I found that very interesting.
Dragons, I mean, you expect dragons in fantasy. So
Yeah.
George Martin having dragons here and there, but he's of course very careful not to kind of overdo it. I mean, that I also appreciate that. For example, when you look at Ishiguro, I mean, Nobel Prize winner for literature.
Oh yeah.
I think it's in the most recent book, The Buried Giant. There you have a dragon. And this obviously irritated some of the critics to no end. So they asked me, why are you writing fantasy? And Ishiguro in turn was irritated and said, why? Just putting a dragon in a book doesn't turn it into a fantasy. So I find to some extent in Ishiguro, it's a symbol for something, but at the same time, it's a very real dragon too.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting where you were talking about how the dragon was able to turn into more than simply, either a real beast or an allegory, but becoming a mixture of the two, as well as still being emblematic to a good degree of place.
Mm-hmm.
I think that a lot of the dragon, literature that, I've been seeing lately, going beyond, just being present in fantasy books, has been focused a bit too much on the biological aspects of the dragon and, how we could potentially bring it to life. There was I think it was actually either History Channel or Animal Planet documentary about that, a couple of years ago. But I think there's been a little bit too much focus on that rather than, how the dragon continues to live in our mind.
Mm-hmm.
How we've kind of been poisoned by it so that it exists forever as an archetype, whether we want to or want it to or not. Do you think that there are some, good examples of the dragon being used in that way nowadays, as opposed to, simply the medieval texts such as Beowulf that, are more emblematic of it from that time?
You mean now in our time being used symbolically or misused or?
More used well, symbolically, rather than, simply trying to create a biological dragon.
Ah, okay, yeah. I mean, probably I'm sorry, the audience probably don't know that, but there is by Michael Ende. He's a German author, and he wrote, they know maybe that, the Never-Ending Story. It was also turned into a movie. There you have also a dragon, a Chinese luck dragon. But for dragons, a very interesting piece is actually one of his children's stories about a train driver and his kind of companion. And they also have to do with dragons. And there, the evil dragon, which has a very speaking name in German, when she goes to the east, then she kind of she transforms into a golden dragon and becomes wise and good.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, that's really cool. So he unites these two traditions, and by simply kind of sending her, or she ending up in the East then, makes this transformation. I found it very fascinating.
That's really cool. So it's almost like she crosses over from one cultural idea to another.
Yeah, yeah.
That's
So
fantastic.
I find it very nice that he puts it into a children's story, so that the
Yeah.
children, I think he wrote in the 70s or 80s back then, so they're familiar with both. They think, okay, yeah, there are good dragons and there are bad dragons. Really.
How do you think we came about in children's books the idea of the cuddly dragon?
That's really absolutely weird. Yeah. It's maybe, it has maybe to do with Disney, that you kind of make almost everything or anything, you subvert it and make it into something harmless. Of course, I mean, Kenneth Grahame's The Reluctant Dragon is at the heart of it. So I think it's 1898 or something like that he wrote this story. And he's still, the story is fun because back then in the 19th century, the dragon definitely was the evil one, was still very much the symbol against which St. George, the national saint of the national patron of England, fights. So as an English woman and as an English mare, as a child growing up in England, you would be very much familiar that the dragon is evil and St. George, the patron, defeats this evil. And now comes this little story which tells about a dragon who somehow has overslept. He's the only dragon still around. And time has moved on, and he's rather peaceful dragon. He's more like a hobbit. He likes, his meal regular. He likes his tea. He writes epic poetry, and he doesn't, of course, want to fight knights, something like that. And so Kenneth Grahame's story is funny because it gives us a dragon that is very, very undragonish. It's everything that a dragon shouldn't be. And I think from then onwards, we have this idea, and it kind of takes off, and you find then suddenly the dragon in advertisement and stuff like that. It's really in places you think, how did we end up there? Of course, then another element is that we have a fascination with dinosaurs. And dinosaurs, you have the whole variety. And you have originally the bad guys like T-Rex. T-Rex kind of step into the footsteps, you could say, the bad dragons. But then, of course, you have the ones who eat just plants and they're big, yes, but basically they're harmless. And so with the dinosaurs, you have these two elements there too. And I think that might be that some of the dragons, interpretation of the dragon, end up on the cuddly side of the dinosaurs, so to speak. And new pattern, maybe.
And you also end up with something really interesting like the good guy Godzilla, fighting against the, bad King Ghidorah.
Indeed. Indeed. So you have this switch, indeed. Originally the bad kind of, and Godzilla, of course, originally, or is presented as a dinosaur. But then this dinosaur suddenly starts to breathe fire, which didn't really do, so.
Yeah, and then you end up with the big bad being King Ghidorah, a multi-headed dragon, which is just a lot of interesting tropes being played on with that.
And I mean, this kind of switch from the big bad beast to suddenly the good guy also happens to King Kong.
True.
When and I mean, there you also have the woman, the virgin, to protect. First of all, they offer the white woman to King Kong. He takes her, so he's the big bad beast. But then comes a T-Rex, a dinosaur, or a dragon. And so they fight for the woman. And in some of the, I'm talking about the black and white 1938, something like King Kong.
Yeah.
There you see the white woman is placed on a tree. She looks down on King Kong fighting the T-Rex. And King Kong takes, it's not a stick, it's more than a stick, almost a young tree, and kind of rams it down the throat, I think, of the T-Rex. And iconographically speaking, this is the very same structure you find in medieval depictions of St. George killing the dragon. You have St. George with a stick, aka a lance.
Yeah.
Kind of defeating the dragon, meaning the dinosaur, and you have the Virgin up there on a hilltop looking down. And so, you know, dragons occur sometimes in places you don't expect them to occur. Sometimes in contexts you don't really also, you think, wait a moment, how did this happen?
Yeah, that's fantastic. That was one of the things that I liked most about reading the book, was how much of it still resonates today, and how many fascinating parallels there are to be found. One thing that I was curious about was the section on particularly the dragon in folklore. You mentioned just how little dragon folklore there is, how we know that this idea persisted throughout the Middle Ages, but how most of the time now trying to find any sort of origin story is just trying to figure out what doesn't quite fit, what might have changed over time.
Yeah, I mean, I was indeed, that's a very important point, because when I submitted the outline of this book, I said, okay, I'll write a chapter on dragon and religion, dragon and medieval romance, dragon in folklore. And then when I actually came to writing it, I found out there is very, very little to almost no records about medieval folklore, proper medieval folklore. What you find, of course, is later, and they tell you, well, it's medieval sources. No, they're not. They want you to believe that their version goes back to the Middle Ages, but they don't. And so, so I was stuck a bit, and I simply had to turn it around and said the medieval dragon in folklore.
Yeah.
Because I cannot pretend that there is something like medieval folklore about the dragon. What we have, of course, you pointed out that before, we do have pictures, paintings, murals, depictions of the dragon in general, and they, of course, they remain as the focal points where new stories are created, or where other stories come and attach themselves to this dragon figure. So if you have a dragon, a picture of a dragon on a wall of a church, that will almost automatically create stories.
Oh, definitely.
And
do you think that the dragon in folklore might not exist as much in written records, because those stories were primarily transmitted orally, and might have had more pre-Christian origins?
Of course, as soon as they would enter, let's say, the written dimension, the written sphere, we probably reinterpreted by the clergy. I mean, basically, those who were writing things down, they were trained men, trained as clergy. And so they also had the Christian mindset and would almost automatically interpret any dragon that comes along as a symbol of the devil or of Satan. And so all those other stories that were transmitted orally that might find expression in those local legends and ballads that we then later on still have from the 17th century. Yes, you simply have to assume that we do have a long tradition of oral transmission. But of course, it's always difficult to track it down.
I believe it was Neil Gaiman who was very adamant that the dragon in Beowulf was meant to be symbolizing the death of the heroic age and the dominance of the church. which was made a bit more overt in the rather interesting film that he contributed to on the matter. Do you agree with that interpretation of the Beowulf dragon?
I mean, of course, you can, again, I mean, the Beowulf is, I'm teaching Beowulf this term.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, fantastic indeed. Beowulf, it's such an interesting piece of work because it's coupled up, very skillfully coupled up, of different elements. I mean, on the one hand, you have this folk tale of the bear's son. I mean, Beowulf, the Beowulf is obviously the bear. And Beowulf is as strong as a bear. He has the strength of 30 men in one of his hands. And so you could say, okay, the first half, his adventure, the fight against these monsters, Grendel and Grendel's mom, is basically the story, the bear's son. And then you have the fight. And the second part is the dragon fight story. It's also a very kind of, you could almost say an archetypal sort of tale. And whether you want to interpret it that way, maybe the Beowulf poet, who was a Christian and who wrote it, we don't really, it's debated whether he wrote it in the 9th century or the 10th century, or as late as the early 11th century, we don't know. Maybe you could argue if he wrote it that late, he was looking back onto what he would felt a lost heroic age. And so it's a kind of a, yes, as an elegy. We don't no longer have these heroes. They died basically with Beowulf and the dragon.
Yeah, it is a very beautiful ending, and there is a certain bittersweet element to it that I've definitely gotten in some of the translations that I've read.
Yeah, yeah.
Seamus Heaney's immediately comes to mind.
True. Another Nobel Prize winner.
Yeah,
there's a dragon all hidden somewhere. Nobel Prize winners, yes.
Maybe that's a prerequisite to get it. You have to have a dragon somewhere.
Yeah, not too obviously, though.
Not too obviously.
No, I mean, we talk now about high literature, but dragons are, of course, also part of what I would call maybe popular tradition. I mean, I'm a great fan of what I could call medieval movies. Well, movies that, you know, pretend to take up a motive from the Middle Ages, they adapt it. And there was this, I think, 2002 movie, The Reign of Fire.
Yes, I remember that one.
Remember that. Yeah. It's all about dragons. And you could think, okay, basically the world is taken over by dragons. They burn everything to ash and eat the ash. No comment on that. Yes, of course. Yeah, that's what they do. And you would think, okay, there are a few humans left, and now where does the movie go from there? I mean, the Americans come, they have still a tank, they have a helicopter, they have weapons. Are we getting something like a dragon splatter movie where they have to kill about 1,000 dragons in the remaining 30 minutes? No, the solution is actually ingenious, and that's why I really like the movie. They bring it down with a little biological trick, which is very flimsy. They say, okay, all the dragons are female, but one. There's only one male dragon, and he's in London. If we get this one male dragon, we just have to wait, and so the problem is solves itself. And so instead of becoming a splatter movie, killing hundreds or thousands of dragons, it again boils down to basically one man against one dragon with a crossbow.
Of course.
And you have Alex, the helicopter pilot, beautiful blonde woman, running around and being kind of the virgin that has to be saved. Yes. You see, you go back to the very kind of basic archetypal structures. Even in a 2002 kind of B-class movie, you think, okay, where are we heading to? They end up with the very same kind of patterns again.
Yeah, it's something that seems almost biological to us. You know, these stories that just speak to us across the ages, no matter how much we might try to escape them.
Indeed, yeah. To some
Yeah.
extent, we always seem to come back consciously or unconsciously. And I mean, by now there's so much of that, what shall I say, of that pattern in our culture. I mean, you don't have to go back to Beowulf, or you don't have to go back to the Greek myths. It's in the movies, it's in the comics, it's in the graphic novels, it's everywhere. And so you just suck it in. And I find it fascinating then to dissect that and to try to trace them down. How did this come about? I mean, most of my students, they know about medieval animals, you know, kind of unicorns, basilisks and all that. They know it from Harry Potter.
Yes.
Yeah. They don't know it from the medieval bestiaries. No,
Yeah.
but it's
Harry
okay.
Potter was interesting in how it treated dragons. The first book definitely did have the dragon as a bit of a stumbling block,
Yeah,
where he has the dragon egg, and that was a little bit of a an obstacle for him to pass, not the final obstacle, but it did sort of position him in an interesting place.
Mm-hmm.
Do you surrender the dragon? Do you keep the dragon?
Mm-hmm.
But then I think it was the fourth book with the Goblet of Fire, where he has to actually fly around the dragons to defeat them.
Yeah, true.
Her dragons are interesting because the phenotypes she explains as being regional variants.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to Dungeons and Dragons, which attempts to cross the linguistic barrier of we have all of these words for dragons and they all mean effectively the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
but let's now say that these words mean specific phenotypes.
Mm-hmm.
It was pretty surprising to me that those kinds of variants, of like it is the wyvern that has the all four legs as well as the wings, if I'm not mistaken. That is entirely Dungeons and Dragons that determined that, from what I can tell.
Indeed, because in traditional parlance, you would say the wyvern has 2 legs and 2 wings.
Mm-hmm.
So it would make biologically more sense.
A little bit.
I mean, having kind of 2 wings and 4 legs, biologically speaking, we are no longer talking mammals or whatever, or kind of vertebrates.
Yeah, it is a little bit of a merging, but
it is, yeah.
For some reason, the idea of the dragon origins coming from an amalgamation of all the things that humans feared, that never quite made sense to me. Because there are so many phenotypical differences that don't really line up with the animals that would have existed there. You would have expected the Asian dragons in particular to be a bit more similar to the Western ones.
That's also interesting. I mean, you have a wide variety of phenotypes in the West, I would say, in the Western tradition. You mentioned the wyvern, and then we have, I mean, even the basilisk is categorized as a dragon. Well, okay. But the East is very, very stable. Basically, at least looking from the outside, that the Eastern dragon, I think, has been in its shape for at least 2,000 years.
They also seems to retain the more aquatic origins and symbolism of the dragon better than the Westerns dragons have. I think that largely in the West, at least in more popular culture, we've kind of lost them as symbols of rivers, which I find interesting because we definitely do have plenty of water, particularly around England, but that hasn't exactly held true over the years.
Would you kind of argue that Loch Ness, Nessie, is kind of a remnant of that, or?
It's interesting because the myth of Nessie does actually have fairly ancient origins. There definitely was something before the famous doctor's photo of the later proven to be toy submarine of her. So there is, if what I recall correctly, she was more of a hippogriff in origin, more of a water horse. Kind of going back into more traditional, Scottish folklore. But over time, as more movies came out, like Land of the Lost, then she gained her more plesiosaurus identity, which is pretty darn delightful and pretty fun, but doesn't exactly, hold as much water as perhaps, the original idea does. I do think, though, that there is a very strong correlation between dragons and sea monsters. You mentioned in the book that some of the language used was the same over the years, or at least was very closely associated. So I do think that there is a definite cultural memory there before the dragon became more of the Christian devil myth, which is cool.
It might be that Christianity kind of helped to crystallize the Western dragon into its peculiar form, so that we have then kind of a prototype or a dominant type. And that before, you're right, I had a look at the sea. Well, I tried to establish what is a sea dragon like. And in Beowulf too, we have these sea monsters mentioned, Nikaras,
yes,
and stuff like that. But they say they translate it sometimes as sea dragons or sea monsters. Basically, we don't know what they are. They must be monsters who live in the water. That's about it. And that's a problem. We often have terms, but we don't have pictures and we don't have definitions.
Yeah.
So kind of on our own, what do we do with that? It's somewhere in the water. It's not very pleasant to meet. What shall we call it? And in our context,
that was the hippocampus, not the hippogriff. I was thinking again of Harry Potter.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Yes, the water horse that can't be rode, which again has some nice correlations with the primal creature. This pure symbol of nature that can't be tamed, no matter how hard you try. It looks alluring, but you get on the back and then you're stuck there.
Okay. With this idea that you have the hippogriff in the air, you have the hippocampus in the water, and of course you have the horse.
Yeah.
You could say a Pegasus as the winged horse, kind of the hippogriff. This is a very kind of traditional idea that you have a kind of a representative of each species in the water, on earth, and in the air. And so the same logic applies for the dragons. You have the dragons in the air. You have the dragons that are more kind of like the lindworms without wings, that are more kind of earthbound. They live in caves. And that you, of course, have also the water dragons. And medieval encyclopedias, they would take this categorization from Isidore of Seville, but they often were too lazy to have new wood prints, new pictures for that categories. So they would simply take, we have a dragon. Okay, it's now the water dragon, but we don't care. We'd simply take the same picture we used for the dragon who lives out of the water and just put it in there again. Our kind of readers will make the mental adjustments necessary.
I think that we have, to some extent, made those mental adjustments.
Indeed, yeah, definitely.
They've lasted so long. Yeah, I wanted to ask you one more thing, which you mentioned that the earliest, I believe in the English maxims, you mentioned of the dragon, mentions them in the barrow, with their hoard.
Yeah.
So if you go back that far and say that this is the original idea of what a dragon is, it's a creature in the barrow with the hoard, what do you think that symbolically that might have originally meant? Like if we if we look at the dragon at the most stripped down that we possibly can, why do you think that held on to our consciousness?
I think it might be a chthonic force, a representation of a chthonic force, earth power, and actually, kind of protecting the treasure that is in the earth, the gold, the silver, the precious things that are there. And but already in Beowulf, it becomes then the counter symbol of the good king. So the good king, what he does do is he gives out his treasure. He doesn't sit on it, but on the opposite, he amasses treasure through his raids, through wars. That's why most of the Germanic tribes were kind of at war with each other, because they were trying to get each other treasure, and the king would kind of give out the treasure, and the dragon does exactly the same, the opposite. It sits on it and doesn't do anything with it, and it's lonely. The dragon hall, the cave, it's only a dragon. Traditionally, the Germanic king's hall, it's full of people, full of his warriors, full of noise. Gold is circulating, so it's a kind of the counter thing.
That's really interesting, and that's also a fun bit of foil, because even Grendel had a mom, but the dragon is still all alone.
But talking of another monster, Fafnir or Fafnir in the Wilsunga saga, wherever you get him in the Norse tradition, being originally a man or a dwarf, whatever, and then turning into a dragon because of the greed for the treasure. And so this really kind of the dragon becomes the embodiment of this greed, this possessiveness that takes over a human being.
The worst possible thing that could happen to a communal culture.
Indeed, and that's very much so. And C.S. Lewis took it up in his one of his Chronicles of Narnia books. Eustace, I think, he is also a greedy boy, and on the island, he also is turned into a dragon because of his greed. So again, this is C.S. Lewis, who of course knew his medieval literature.
Oh, definitely.
He put it in there in the children's book, and I don't know for how million children now they think dragons about greed. So that's
really powerful.
It is,
So I don't want to keep you for too long. So, finally, what do you want people to most take away, from your book on dragons?
I think to have an open mind and look around themselves, whether they are sitting in the cinema or, kind of out in a theme park or so, wherever they encounter a dragon or a dinosaur or something dragon-like or that functions like a dragon, to kind of be curious about it and start investigating and start, why is this so? And what is the story behind it? I think as soon as if you keep this open, inquisitive mind, you will have I think something like a richer intellectual life, because you can participate in your tradition, in your culture better. You also get to know other cultures, of course. That's very interesting. But it will lead you to new dimensions. Probably you wouldn't have thought about it. And I found this really kind of always, it's like a quest a bit, a never-ending quest.
I think that the never-ending quests are often the best ones.
True. If I might conclude with one final example from a movie.
Of course.
I'm not quite sure whether the younger members of the audience still watch it, but probably do. Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
Yes.
Of course. I think it's one of the best kind of medieval movies, if we want to call it like that. And there you have a moment when you think, now we need a dragon.
Oh, yes.
When the sorcerer brings them to the cave, and he says, do you see the monster? And all there is a little bunny.
Yes.
A rabbit. And I'm not quite sure whether Monty Python, they had a medievalist in their group, so maybe he was thinking about that. What they did is actually they take this idea of the cuddliest of animals and put it in the place where you expect the most horrible of animals. But the cuddliest of animals behaves actually like the most horrible of animals, like a dragon, and kills a lot.
Fantastic.
So I found this a great scene. So you don't have the cuddly dragon, but you have the cuddly rabbit that turns out to be as dangerous or even more dangerous than the dragon. I just love that. Yeah.
It is absolutely fantastic. It's definitely one of the most iconic scenes in the film, too.
Killer rabbit. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, can we expect more work from you soon on the topic?
On dragons, maybe not, but yeah, I'm more working at the moment a bit on Game of Thrones, and probably sooner or later, of course, I will deal with the dragons there. Yeah.
Well, honestly, I look forward from any new work from you. I thought that your writing was fantastic, and I can't wait to be able to talk to you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
My thanks to Professor Honegger for taking the time to discuss his book, and to Hilary for writing the review and speaking to the author. You'll find the review of Introducing the Medieval Dragon on the Folklore Podcast website, and the book is available from the University of Wales Press. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.